most of the time when I'm speaking to someone over Zoom for like personal development things, they're usually a young man who's still living at home with their parents. And then there's lots of therefore specific issues that come up around that. So one of the things that comes up is the person says that they'd quite like to repair a relationship with their parent because they're living with them. And that sounds like a good idea, you know, but obviously you guys have encouraged, and rightfully so, the default position with someone who's got some kind of parental issue wouldn't be, or parental complex, wouldn't be to move towards them. It would be to differentiate their identity away, so they've got their own sort of internal place to stand, that kind of sense of ego strength. But my main question around that would be the meta-instinctual architecture behind that. So does the genome have an anticipation for, say, repairing a relationship with a parent, or is it more the meaning-making machinery that goes into forming, say, the personal equation and an understanding of oneself instead?
Well, that's a great question. What I would say in a practical sense is that when we look or we encounter meta-instincts, there are two ways. There's the artifactual way that we mentioned yesterday, pardon me if my voice goes, which is basically the process of moving the ego into the unconscious, not moving the unconscious towards the ego that we discussed yesterday. So anybody who's not seen yesterday's, please view that. We go into that into great detail. The other one is where it just simply, and this is the usual one, where it naturally presents itself and we feel it as a sense of urgency or an impulse to go and do something. That's the drive state. That's closely associated to Panksepp. But the actual meta instinct that you're talking about, until we access that and have a conscious relationship to it, we do not know how it will configure, because it configures in relationship to access. Even when it presents, it's an invitation to access because it's presented, but it's not necessary for you to consciously, under normal conditions, to access it, because the drive pushes us to act it out without it burdening consciousness. And that's an important distinction, because Jungians chase archetypes, as they call them, all the time. And a lot of the time, they'll turn out to be pure fantasies, compensatory fantasies, which are connected to Pankseppian drives, but to Pankseppian drives that do not have yet a fully articulated context to operate within. And that's when the fantasy can become the trap. If, however, we catch at that peri-moment when the meta-instinct is about to represent itself, pardon me, it will impact consciousness with a bow wave of affect, and then we'll feel ourselves looking off somewhere or feeling something. Then it becomes somatic, and then it's an impulse, and it's unclear because it's not become cognitive. It's not yet superpositioned into a cognitive state that the ego can integrate in a normal way, but it does feel the superpositioning of genome, of meta instinct, without it being fully ego conscious, and Pankseppian drives impacting the ego to impel it to adapt in the world. So we can only really find out what the meta instincts are by attempting to enter into them. If we don't go into them, but instead try to interpret what comes to us, that's when the ego generates fantasy. It's such a subtle difference, because when the bow wave hits us of the affect of something that's about to come into consciousness, the ego is aware of that, cannot make any cognitive sense of it, but feels the impulse to act. Then there'll be a dim awareness of some kind of context. And then the ego is meant to look into the world and say, I will do that. Then the pressure relaxes a little and we go and achieve something. Then it relaxes completely and is replaced by something else. So we eventually find what the meta instinct is, normally by acting, and therefore instinctive pressure reduces. Now, there is a third position, obviously, and that is when we're asleep and the normal ego is offline, and the background processing that goes on within the psyche can produce images, dreams, representations, which indicate the presence of a meta instinct in its proper form. And at that point, if we can grab hold of the dream, then we can, in normal consciousness, decide to go in. But going in is different, I honestly think, in kind, from the way that Jungians modeled the notion of integrating into ego consciousness if we attempt to do that, what comes in has to be spear-shaped, because the tip is probably all that's going to break surface tension into consciousness. The rest of it will never get in, because the ego can only contain so much anyway. But as I described yesterday in that specific technique, when the ego dissociates from itself and creates a vessel, a vehicle that can go in with a maintained boundary and experience the psyche as the psyche wants to represent itself, without the attachments of self-concept identified complexes, fictions which have been introjected from the culture. So we're not looking and seeing, oh, there's the Jungian shadow and there's the anima. Or if we've been impressed by psychoanalysis, then we won't see the Oedipus complex, or we might see the Oedipus complex if we have been, the castration complex, or if it's a Kleinian psychoanalytic model we've been educated in, we'll see breasts everywhere, that kind of thing. So what we're influenced by is what the ego will go in with, unless it separates itself from itself and then opens itself up to the experience within. That is similar then to being in a lucid dream, but not completely so, because most lucid dreamers believe that they are controlling the dream. They believe they are, but you cannot demonstrate that that is true, because the belief is simply the way that the ego, the dream ego, which is now more closely related to the conscious ego, attempts to make sense of its experience whilst in the dream state. Then the dream state is organic, it is a brain state, it's a very definite state. It is not waking consciousness, it's an altered state of consciousness. So if you can go into a lucid dream state and not believe that you can change anything unless you're allowed to, you will then start to see what the unconscious wants to give you. If you're in a lucid dream state and you start to determine, because you apparently can, you can alter things and experiences, the dream will eventually evaporate, it will move away from you and you won't have the experience, because the homeostatic function is basically saying, that is not what I intended, I will withdraw from you. And then you can wake yourself up and get on with your day and think yourself quite important about what you've just experienced, but you've not experienced me being in this context, the unconscious. So it's similar to that, except that you do not impose anything. That's what I'm trying to get across. The lucid dreamer who believes he or she is in control of the experience imposes through internal projection into the so-called lucid dream. When we separate the ego off and go inside and meet the unconscious as it wants to present, we must be aware, alert, respectful, with a proper boundary, but receive what we are meant to understand. And then we can return that back to ego consciousness and integrate only what we need to integrate, because that is what will be given to us, because the state is homeostatically regulated. There is a difference between that and psychosis, because what comes into the ego during psychosis is a fragmentation grenade that goes off and blows the ego apart, and it desiccates, and there's all sorts of things flying around, and homeostasis has failed. So we don't want a state like that. We want to maintain an ego position, but not the ego's attitude to the outer world taken into the inner world. It's a different state. I'm sorry if that was a complicated response, James, but that's... No,
it's absolutely fantastic. There's so much in there. I'm thinking then, so when working with these other people, there's a difference, and an important qualitative difference between what the meta instinct actually is and what the adaptation that the person might need to therefore do.
Yeah.
So in other words, what is without and what is within are the same, but they're also different at that sort of informational level.
Yeah.
So
you will get under ideal conditions what you need, but no more than that.
With you, yeah.
If an over, and this is what I meant about psychosis. Psychosis is the ultimate overamping of the ego, so it just bursts. In essence, it fragments. You don't get in true psychosis subpersonalities operating. What you get is a complete fragmentation, which is what schizophrenia means. It's a fragmented personality. It is not an organized subset of a personality at all. Fantasy generates relationships to things that don't exist as if they were extensions of ourselves. That's a function of a normal ego when it's not adapting to the outer world, is to generate that kind of fiction. And that's what I would hold up, dare I say it, as an accusation to most Jungians, that when they employ what they call active imagination, they are literally fantasizing from the perspective of the ego, because they haven't let go of the ego's conditioning. And that's because they don't know enough about dissociation. They don't know enough about hypnosis. They reject it without knowing what it is, which is a stupid error, but they do. So a homeostatic system will make the adjustment that you need. Therefore, when you are in connection in this conscious way that I described yesterday and reiterating somewhat now, when you do that, you are entering into a homeostatic relationship to what you need to know, which is represented by a meta-instinctual representation. So at a different time, it's a different thing. The major issue in integrating that is when you bring through that particular system that I've mentioned, when you return back to a normally associated ego, it's like moving from a lucid dream to being wide awake instantly, or pretty much. There's usually a period where a person reorientates themselves and various other thoughts and feelings come around, and we're aware of somatic sensations. That's in the dream state. But when you do this, when you come back, you're going to hit something else, and you're going to hit where your own complexes have been laying dormant with respect to attachment to you, but still functioning. And their affect, their cognitions will try to reassociate to you on the way back in. And one of the natural defenses against that is a very powerful surge of pure affect, which equals numinosity and meaning on the way back. So the last homeostatic gift on the way back is to feel the transcendent function, to feel the elevation, so you can get past the complexes, get past them without them stopping you. But when you then get back into the ego, you have to attenuate that inflated feeling that you're getting in order to associate back to cognition, but with an understanding that comes from meaning. The understanding that comes from meaning finally will be cognitive. So we have to let go of the affect, which has allowed us to bypass the complexes, which has been gifted to us from within. So there's many obstacles on the road when we do this. And it's also mirrored when it happens naturally. If we suddenly get taken over by a very powerful emotion from within and a deep sensation of an ancestral experience or a correlation of an ancestral experience, all of these factors are co-present. The immediate environment impresses upon us. Our complexes are circling, trying to get back into orientation and representation within our self-concept. But we have this immense feeling that something very powerful has happened, and we may be tearful or shaking, but we do need to reorientate the ego. And if that's the problem, how do we reorientate the ego without reconstituting everything that went before? And that's where the skill comes in. That's where the self-analysis comes in. And that's where the progressive understanding of the process comes in, and where we do need a model, but be able to set the model aside and go through the experience. But when we reassociate the ego, the model, which we've pressure tested already, is still there in cognition to receive what's coming into fresh association to consciousness. So that's the theoretical and technical side of it. But when it comes to the example that you gave, then I'll assume it's a young man for the sake of argument. The young man who wants to separate from his parents and make his own way in the world will be under massive instinctual pressure to do that. But there'll also be a part of him which is a kinship bond, which is a meta instinct as well. It's genetic and it's psychosocial and it's cultural. Even if he's had a bad reputation to his or bad experience of his parents, there's still that overlay that if he'd have had better parents, and this is what, for example, Anthony Stevens calls frustration of archetypal intent. We were meant to relate optimally to our parents. It didn't happen. There's a deficit. There's still an attachment based on that. All of these things will be felt at the same time. But the way the instincts deal with that, it's through Pangsep and to drive the seeking system to say, go out and relate. Then you can come back. Then it's like the idea of the hero that goes off on the journey and is not prepared for the world because his relationship to his parents wasn't right. He has many trials, tribulations, failings, and then success. And then he returns and gets confirmation from the father. And at the same time, he liberates his father from his ancestral issues, which might be his father or his grandfather, whoever passed down the generations, various things. You can see how all of that would be represented in a narrative. But what an individual needs is not the whole story, but only what he or she needs. And it's the teasing out of that which strengthens the ego, because otherwise we're left with a very expansive myth, which has a genetic and a psychosocial and cultural representation that resonate. And it's like, what do I do? What do I do? An internet guru will tell me what to do, or a fantasy, and then we don't do anything. So it's around the nuances of that, I think, James.
Yeah, again, fantastic answer. Thank you. You framing it in terms of that kinship bond really, really helps, because when working with someone, I'm always trying to be careful to say, when you're watching someone, say, is this person, is it them, or is this a complex that's speaking and wanting to be confirmed? Like, for example, someone with some kind of wound regarding one of the parents, if I encourage them to be like, heal your relationship with your parents, there's the kinship bond there, but then there's also potentially a complex at work. By default, I encourage a separation of identity away. But from what you've said, it sounds like regardless of whether or not there's that desire to go back, there's going to be an even stronger desire to go forward in life that person might not even be ego conscious of at that current time. So be to tease that out of the person, really, and then present that back to them, perhaps.
Yes, and you'll get all of the fantasies which will replace action in the world. And those fantasies then will feed into attachments to other father figures. The kind of internet guru who gets the father wound projected onto them. And you can see that that's it. That's what's trapping them. And that is the complex, because the complex arises out of the maladaptation that the ego has thus far achieved for itself. Because even a maladaptation is an achievement, because we have to live to acquire complexes. That's another paradox which reinforces them. But a positive complex, of course, and they do exist, but they're the ones we hardly notice, are the ones which give us the idea that we can achieve something with this instinctive pressure that's coming through. So the negative complexes start out as a result of some kind of failure or trauma, failure of adaptation or trauma in our life. And they function to protect us initially, and then they become a problem. So the payoff is that it might mean that we survive by giving into a complex, or it might mean that the complex makes things so unpleasant that instincts are forced to overcompensate for the maladaptation and push past and impel us into action. It seems to be that that's where we're at with our imperfect evolution.
And is therefore is that one of the roles then of the trickster function, to take that complex and push it as hard as it can to get the instincts then to kick in? Yeah, okay, I'm with you.
Yes, and if somebody is really good at doing something, but that's not solving the problem for them, one of the ways that the homeostatic principle, broadly speaking, can act through what we would collapse into the trickster function for the purposes of explanation, and it's a kind of a reification with all the errors that come from that, is to over-amp what we do really well, because that will cause problems of adaptation. And then we will start to feel the agitation that has been repressed up until that point, the agitation of the seeking system, for example, to push past our own one-sidedness. Now, the Jungians think of one-sidedness as constellating an opposite, and then you have to look for the transcendent function. If we did that, we would be very introverted, very schizoid, we would be contemplative, we would sit in our room all day and all night and read and write and do whatever and not live. And that sounds to me like a Jungian analyst, and not like somebody who wants to link with their instincts and go out and make changes in the world, which surely is the intention of an evolutionary ancient model or process like the 7 basic emotional systems of Panksepp. They don't seem in and of themselves to want to accommodate passivity, schizoid withdrawal, or anything like that. They're all about action in the world. But because homeostasis is real, they will all adjust and calm themselves down when we start to do the right thing. And there's a nuance there which is lost for a lot of Jungians, because they just copy and paste what they imagine Jung was like, insert it in themselves and transfer that onto their patients. And then nobody does anything. That's why it takes years.
So on the say someone who's got schizoid withdrawal, because you guys obviously have spoken on the YouTube channel before about how fantasy can be maladaptive, but lots of people don't see it that way because it's not painful in the here and now. You know, like if someone's got some kind of psychosomatic issue, or they really can't relate psychosocially, they're going to be in active pain. But with fantasy, it's not. So could we say that the schizoid Jungian analyst type who's sitting there reading and writing all day, is the fantasy that guy's sucked into, is that the equivalent on sort of an informational level as someone who's got like an active painful neurosis going on? It's just presenting in like a different way that's like a holding space.
Yeah. If you're offered, if you're a young man, which you are, of high potential, which you are, but this bit you're not, this third bit, and you're deeply neurotic, and then you go to a Jungian and you're inducted into that way of thinking and relating to what they call the inner world, then you're turning the ego around from its proper focus, which is the outside world, and asking it to understand an alien world that doesn't want to be interfered with. The unconscious doesn't like being interfered with. It wants the ego to do its job. The unconscious seems to prefer to self-regulate itself. Now, the fantasy element then comes around by whatever emerges is given a name, like the shadow, or whatever, or the anima, or anything like that. And then people then start to generate more and more versions of outer life as an interpretation of the inner life that is really resisting them because they're looking in the wrong place. And then they generate the fantasies of holding space to maintain some kind of equilibrium. And sometimes there is a reward for that, because some of these people become Jungian analysts. And as was said by Graham, they can make a lot of money by doing that. And then pyramid selling, as Pauline was saying yesterday, that way of doing things. But generally speaking, then that person's high potential is not actualized in the world. And they're going to have to do something about instinct for the rest of their life. Yeah. And when they feel it, they'll say, that's my shadow. Because it's everything that I'm not. That's right. You're not living an instinctive life. Therefore, you've made a homeostatic problem for yourself. But when you experience it, you rationalize it as being the shadow or the negative anima. And then you start writing about it and generating fantasies about it. And then there are other people who share the fantasy. If it's two people, it's a folie à deux. That's a psychiatric term. And then if it gets beyond that, it's even worse. It's a cultural psychosis, albeit a subcultural one at this level, because there aren't that many Jungians in the world, but they all share the same kind of fantasy and that lack of adaptation to things. So it can go wrong there. But some people will wake up and that they'll realize that this is largely an illusion, an ego fiction. And one of the ways that the easiest ways of coming across this, if we're inclined towards depth psychology, is to follow the Freud-Adler-Jung equation. Jung paradoxically gave the way out, and he said, you must understand Freud first and then Adler. Freud basically represents instinct. He didn't get it right 100%, but he at least made the effort. Adler represents psychosocial adaptation, the outside world. And then if we want to have the luxury of introspection and so forth, we can move on to Jung. But if you try and start with Jung, then you make an enemy of Freud necessarily and an enemy of Adler. It's a little like, by metaphor, if I can bring a mythopoetic thing in, the Judgments of Paris. Only on this occasion, Paris has the apple, and standing in front of him is Freud, Adler, and Jung. And who does he give the apple to? Whichever one he gives the apple to, the other two become his problem. But if you can avoid that, having to make that selection, and instead incorporate the background of all three, then somehow it seems to work.
I'm with you. Okay. And we then also know that these fantasies are contained within, say, a deep structure complex.
Yes.
Right. Which obviously then sits on top of that meta instinct.
Yeah.
Is that so? So let's take this Jungian analyst type, for example, and say he needs analysis himself.
Yeah.
Those fantasies will say that are contained within its deep structure complex. Is it that deep structure complex which should be responsible for projection and transference, for example? So again, like a what is within, so too is without. So that filter, or that port reeve between the ego and the meta instinct, representing the ego to itself, therefore appears on the outside as that which someone needs to become conscious of, if you kind of see what I mean. So they're kind of all in the same place, and they're the same information, just represented differently.
Yes, All complexes are capable of projection because of the way informational monism works and superpositioning works. Anything that is within can appear without. The special qualities of deep structure complexes, though, are these. Firstly, when we experience them, it's an internal mirror. But there's also, as Konrad Lorenz says in his book, there's something behind the mirror. And I had no idea that Konrad Lorenz had written this. I only a couple of days ago heard about this book of his that other people have been rejecting in biology because they thought it was strange, that there is something behind the mirror. This is something we've experienced for the whole of our career. But the mirror is literally a reflection back, but there's a purpose in that, that without seeing something familiar, we will not be able to get close enough to that which is very unfamiliar. There'll be a gap problem, a boundary to cross, which would not allow information to move. So the deep structure complex is a kind of surface structure modification of instinct to show how far we have developed our understanding of meta instincts. And it's reflected back to the ego. But the ego, being narcissistic, this is where Narcissus in the pool comes in, sees his reflection in the water of the unconscious, and there he sees his deep structure complex and thinks how wonderful he is. And that's how far I've got. And of course, if that's a Jungian, oh, there's me, but it's not really me, it's the big me, it's the big S, that's the self archetype, which is an inflation by projection, an amplifying mirror, a foreground distorting mirror of his own ego projected internally. And that's when they psychologize something which stands behind it, which is not psychological in that ordinary sense at all. It's beyond it. Now, you can think that in this way that the potential configuration of deep structure complexes will take on anything that we believe and have not tested objectively outside of ourselves. So the critical factor within the ego, it's supposed to be concerned with the reality principle in the outside world. If we don't apply a reality principle to that which we internalize in the form of theory, we will uncritically see it and project it internally inside. Therefore, we will see the anima in whatever form we've been told that it exists. The shadow, the self, all of these things they'll all be in there. And it is also then part of the trickster, if you can see about that, because it's involved in the homeostatic regulating principle. And if you push it too much, the trickster will start to get a bit pissed off with us. And then it will utilize that which we believe and reflect back at us to overamp the problem. And then it'll be, what's the ego going to do about this? It's going to generate more fantasies. Oh, I've spoken to the self. I've spoken to the negative anima. I'll write this down. I'll journal it. And meanwhile, there's no adaptation to the outer world. Panksepp will push like hell. What do we do with that? We will project it. So whose fault is it? Well, if I'm a Jungian, it's the Freudian's fault. Yeah, that's it. These are just unanalyzed Freudian issues. Well, that's right. Yeah, they're unlived, unintegrated, unrelated to, and so on. So we have to be critical and apply the reality principle to everything that we believe, that we've experienced on the outside. And then when we turn the outside inside and look in, expect to see what we've learned reflected back to us. And the challenge is meet that properly. Separate from it. The minute we begin to disidentify with what we project internally, it will reconfigure. That's the point at which it becomes a Port Reeve, the guardian, and will metaphorically gesture over its shoulder to the place you need to go. Only don't take your fantasies in there with you. What's in there is real. That's the difference.
And really, you should apply that principle to the example that James has just given about the hypothetical young man living with their parents, because the last thing probably that the young man will want to do is to say, does the problem lie with me? Or can I continue to blame my parents for the predicament that I'm in? And you see that an awful lot.